Charles, first of all, welcome. If you would, just tell our viewers a little bit about yourself and your background.
First of all, thanks for asking me over. So look, I've been farming 40 or more years, grazing operation in southern Australia, in between getting a university education, and I went back 36, 7 years after my undergraduate to do a PhD looking at why I interviewed 80 odd leading regenerative farmers in Australia, and I asked the question, what made them do that paradigm shift to a regenerative space from an industrial? So that's what, and I did that because having made mistakes in my own farming, because I had to take over our farm when I was 22, when my father got sick and died. So I became a good industrial farmer, so I damaged my landscape, set stocks, ploughed, and then ended up with a big droughts after we had a big 5-year drought in the 80s, and we had a very remunerative a genetic business in merino sheep, because we'd evolved an improved sort, and so I made the decision to look after my animals and not the landscape. Ended up with a big debt because we had to feed them, and that's what triggered me to shift to the regenerative agriculture space and led to my book, and which came out of my PhD. I wrote a book more about the whole regenerative agriculture movement, and so I guess that's the journey I've been on, and which has probably led to coming over here to talk to you guys.
You know, that's interesting because we hear that similar stories quite a bit. Of course, one of my partners, Gabe Brown, has a very similar story. I myself have a very similar story with both the academic background, by the way, and also the fact that I got heavily entrenched into the commodity and conventional sector, and just like you, discovered that it wasn't working. And we were very quickly losing any kind of net margin that we thought we had, along with steady degradation of the soil. We were quickly losing health and performance in our livestock. And I would imagine you saw the same in your sheep.
I did, and in the transformation, once you swing to an ecological system, you break that intestinal worm cycle. I have had up to 200 cows in a breeding operation, so I've had a bit of experience with them, but we only bring cattle in now. We don't get the rapid growth that you probably need for cattle.
Right.
We're fairly tough, dry country. But in a big season, I will bring in cattle to mulch on agistment and then out again. But you're quite right. And the rising industrial inputs for cropping and even animal anthelmintic treatments and fertilisers and stuff, the change to regenerative agriculture is just so, both financially, ecologically, socially, it's such a remarkable shift. And I think the benefit of these conferences is that the next generation won't have to go through our pain, making costly mistakes. Hopefully that they'll be able to come in fresh and just see the multiple benefits.
That's what we're hoping.
Yeah.
So you wrote a book called The Call of the Reed Warbler. Tell us a little bit about your book.
Yeah, it's subtitled A New Agriculture, A New Earth. So I did a PhD, as I mentioned, looking at why farmers had changed that paradigm. And because paradigms are hard to change, and it takes a shock, like we had for various reasons.
Especially among farmers, right?
Yeah.
We're a stubborn group.
Well, we are, but I think paradigms are powerful wherever you are.
Yes.
But particularly in farming, because you grow up in a culture and a family, and I've always loved writing, so I've written other books, and I thought to myself, how am I going to get this picture over with some of the scientific, because I'm a trained zoologist and did human ecology, without it being heavy and unreadable? How do I access the average farmer or a young person? And so the secret is stories. We're made for stories as a species. So I tried to make it a journey in teaching ecological literacy with all these wonderful stories around that. And and that's really the guts of the book, and then got into a bit more of the ecology and then the human implications. So it's,
Right.
and that seems to have worked because it seems to be selling pretty well.
You gave a presentation this morning at the Grass-Fed Exchange, and there were several things that really intrigued me with what you said. One was you started off talking about how ag land globally has degraded severely.
Yep.
And basically 5 out of every 14 hectares of land is now severely degraded.
That's land that's available for human agricultural use. Absolutely right, and that's a vast area. Yeah, billions of hectares.
And it's quite scary.
Yeah.
To know that we have taken it to that point.
Yeah.
And you also you showed a slide that had basically you started in Egypt.
Yeah.
Came across up where
Yeah.
Israel and all of that is located now.
Yeah.
And thousands of years ago, that was a very, very fertile area.
Yeah.
And now it's very desertified. So how did that happen? How did we go from being very fertile to very desertified?
Yeah, that's a key question. And what I said in my talk, and I'm constantly saying, is there is an historical precedent of human agriculture taking landscapes towards desert inevitably. That's traditional practices. And that's staring us in the face, and we have to learn from it. So that, as everyone knows, our Western type of agriculture evolved in that Middle Eastern area called the Fertile Crescent, 10 to 12,000 years ago, when they domesticated what were weedy annual things called cereals, which domesticated our modern cereals and stuff. And the first animals to be domesticated other than the dog were sheep and goats, because they're much easier. You can imagine, grab a potty lamb. And
Right.
but that came off, the grasslands were like your original prairies, unbelievable, healthy, diverse, spongy, water absorbent, full of carbon. A lot of the Mediterranean basin right around, Lebanon with all this beautiful Lebanese pines and stuff, that was forested, a lot of it.
Yes.
And so what then happened in progressive phases, that's where the first big civilizations, or some of them, evolved on the Tigris, Euphrates. And they pretty soon, through over-irrigation, got salt into those beautiful flats. The grasslands were eaten out with set stocking as animal herding developed. The trees were cleared around the river, around the Mediterranean. And then I'm suggesting to people, have a look now at that area. Iran, Iraq, Libya, it's all desert.
Yeah.
And go down on the top end of Africa, the same, Chad,
Yes.
all those countries.
Yes.
Not just desert, constant drought, and therefore social conflict,
Yeah.
which we don't have to be reminded of. And as I travel Australia and what I've seen of America, same story. At various stages, from early middle stages of desertification to severe desertification, it's happening. And everyone's blind to it. They're not acknowledging that this is happening and it's accelerating. And so I put that up there to shape paradigms, but my talk is all about the positive, which is flip that, and it's solvable and we can regenerate. Maybe not to the original extent, but to a stage of health which has other implications.
And you showed some astounding slides from many different places in the world that have done exactly that. They have taken areas that have been essentially desertified and restored those areas. And those were fabulous examples of what can be done. You made a statement in your presentation where you said we have landscape illiteracy.
Yeah.
Could you explain what you mean by that?
First of all, I'm glad there's one person paying attention to that talk. I reflected on my own journey, making those mistakes as a young, 20, 30-year-old. And I was doing that because I hadn't been taught how landscapes functioned, how the ecology worked. So I just saw it as an inanimate landscape that you could belt and extract some profit, and it was resilient. which we now know it's not.
Yes.
And so, I mean, people like Alan Savory and other ecologists will talk about the key landscape functions. But I thought one of the things, if I could do in my book, through illustrating with great stories, is teach this very simple A, B, C, D, E form of ecological literacy as to how landscapes function, how everything has co-evolved to this extraordinary degree. And in nature, if you get stuff working, nature has a propensity to self-organise itself up to better health,
Yep.
if enabled. And we're not taught any of those things, and so, but it's sort of basic. This co-evolved animals, plants, microbes, the whole biodiversity thing, it's there for a reason, and
Yes.
nature's been doing it for a long while, and she's very good at it.
Yes.
And we think we can simplify it down to, and we're paying the consequences: desertification, unhealthy food because there's no nutrients in the food, all those sorts of things. So my book is pretty much built around the stories hinging on those key landscape functions, and then talking about implications out of that.
How does somebody make the journey of ecological literacy?
Other than reading the book, you mean? No, I'm being a bit flippant there. Well, I think there are some wonderful educational groups in the regenerative agriculture space now, teaching. Savory Institute in Australia, we got resource consulting services, some of the biological soil people, good agroforestry groups across the spectrum of regen ag. In Australia, I'm not too sure about the States. We don't have any universities teaching it yet because the industrial paradigm is very powerful because all the power in society, the big chemical companies, policy, regenerative agriculture is still the challenging paradigm.
Yeah.
But there's some wonderful networks around, and conferences like this sort of open people up to the space, and that's why things like grass-fed exchanges such critical organisations actually.
Yeah, and there's, of course, we've got some good efforts here in North America, like the Soil Health Academy, and efforts that are going on with Farmers Footprint and Kiss the Ground and others.
Yep.
So we are starting to see some really sincere and meaningful efforts underway,
Yep.
which is a good thing. So in your presentation, you also talked about, in making this journey to ecological literacy, you talked about the 5 landscape functions.
Yeah.
Could you describe what those functions are and what the meaning of those functions
Sure.
is?
Well, it's almost like the ABC. If you want a sort of dummies course, and I don't mean that pejoratively, if you want the basic introductory course to understanding landscape function, you can simplify it down to 5. I mean, most of the ecological teaching talks about 4, the biophysical ones, which is obviously the solar cycle, from which plants convert that energy, grab carbon dioxide, turn it into sugars, basically, which both lets the plant grow, but also that those sugars feed the soil biology and the whole box and dice. Then there's the water cycle, which can only come from a healthy soil, and the cycling of water, and we've just discussed desertification, which is really arose because we first of all destroyed that small water cycle that cycles water, and microparticles from plants, the rain seeding units. So that's solar water cycle is the other really big one, which I think is behind this as well, is the soil mineral cycle.
Yes.
Which is a constant cycling. I mean, it's in a country like Australia with ancient soils, we haven't got a lot of phosphorus and all those things, so the ecology has evolved to rapidly cycle, dog-eat-dog sort of approach. So that's why it's called a cycle, and that's fundamental, and it underpins the whole of civilization, this healthy soil. And then the 4th one, of course, which sometimes isn't regarded as sexy, but it's fundamental, and that's biodiversity or dynamic ecosystems. from which we get pest resistance to disease and all those things. And then I've chucked in the fifth one, which people tend to forget, which is us, that we're humans who, through our management of landscapes and other things, you know, in our industrial pollutants,
Yep.
we can drastically influence how those functions work. And that's all to do with the paradigms
Yes.
that we carry. So that's why that I call the human social. And I guess the overarching point of those five is you can't treat any in isolation, because I showed a diagram with arrows going everywhere. You damage one of them, say drop your level of plants and drop your photosynthetic level, everything else is negatively impacted. If you start regenerating one of them, everything is positively impacted. So it's this critical interrelationship there all together.
So why are grazing animals essential to be able to restore a fully functioning ecosystem?
Yeah, that's the key question. We've just discussed where 35% of the Earth's agricultural or potential surface outside ice and steep mountains has been degraded.
Right.
The only way we're going to regenerate broad areas of those, because a lot of those areas are semi-desert or very arid and you can't farm them.
Right.
But we now know from the extraordinary work with regenerative grazing, holistic grazing, whatever you want to call it, you can rapidly, even semi-arid, desertified landscapes, when it's managed properly, it will start to rebuild those five functions we talked about. And they're now finding, as the new ecological cropping movements get going, and we discussed a number of them today, multi-species cover crops, pasture cropping, natural intelligence agriculture, we can now crop and get better yields and 1/10 of the cost through ecological mechanisms with biological inputs and right technology. But integral to that full functioning, to get that sort of tip over point in the soil that leads to the takeoff, is you need to have animals putting cover down to protect the soil, and with ruminants you've got healthy cycling of humates and all those sorts of other products and the bugs and stuff which are... Because most of those landscapes, if not all of them, are co-evolved to have animals in the cycle anyway. So I think that's the message we're learning in regenerative ag. We need the two components. Cropping needs the animals, and we can regenerate, pretty much desert country if it's managed properly with animals.
So in other words, if we take the animals out of the equation, in a lot of crop farming globally, we have done exactly that. But if we take the animals out of the equation, it's almost impossible to have a truly intact and fully functioning ecosystem.
Pretty much right. Yeah, they're an integral part of that diverse, functioning, co-evolved community. Now, there's a debate in Australia where we didn't have ruminant animals originally. We only had marsupials, macropods. But we had, until 50,000 years ago, when a lot of the plants evolved, we had giant megafauna who were playing the same role as elephants. So the elephants in Africa, where the ruminants work, they open up thorn bush country to create the grasslands. And the evidence shows that it looks like our elephant-sized big wombat, badger type animals, called diprotodons, were doing the same. So we're now finding we already had some African grass species anyway. Thermida genus and Eregrostis and things like that, probably light seeds that came over. So we're finding that holistic ecological grazing in Australia is working just as well as other continents. So the same principles seem to apply, and as far as I know, and I'm very confident, there's no other method to both regenerate degraded grasslands, but same in cropping. If you want to really get these transformative tip-overs to healthier soil, the evidence is appearing that some form of animal rotation and laying down protective cover and that cycling of nutrients is integral.
I would wholeheartedly agree. So why is diversity of plant species so important?
Well, you're full of easy questions today, aren't you? Well, it's a pretty one number rule in nature. Diversity, diversity, diversity. Number 1, 2, 3 almost. Well, it's complex ecosystems, the grasslands and shrubs. Nature hates a vacuum, and so over time you have this extraordinary diversity of annual plants with functions like big seeds they drop, and perennial plants and deep-rooted forbs and annuals and legumes. So, nature's worked it out. We don't need fertiliser. We've got plants to get the nitrogen and the recyclers of other nutrients and the concentrators, and they're growing at different depths, doing different roles. They're releasing different exudates. They're sponsoring different microbial world underneath. And when you get all that going, it's almost a simple rule. Once you start increasing your diversity in grasslands and crops, we now know, you're getting healthier and healthier soil function and better cycling of nutrients, and your fertility and your fixing of carbon starts to go up, and it's transformative. And you can't do it certainly can't do it with monocultures or even simple function.
Exactly. So in your opinion, what are the 3 principles of good farming?
Well, I would put having humility first. That's nature knows a lot better than we do, and we should work with her and not against her. Second one, I would say get as much biodiversity functioning, which means, and the third one would be the integration of your green plant matter photosynthesizing with animals in that landscape. If you want me to simplify it to 3, and
yes,
that's off the cuff, but that'd be the 3 that immediately strikes me.
Outstanding. So, what is the ultimate test of a moral society?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not going to quote a lot of stuff from Leopold and Wendell Berry and other heroes of mine, but the ultimate test of a moral society is one that cares for the earth that sustains us and all the creatures and plants and organisms within it, and therefore cares for each other as well.
So the world that we essentially have inherited and the world that our children are going to inherit is a true test of our character and what we have done, isn't it?
You're absolutely right, but, as we've been talking, of all spaces in human activity now, if you're talking about climate change, if you're talking about human health, and even the regeneration of rural societies, which are the ones that have suffered enormously with the simplification of industrial ag, the practices of regenerative agriculture provide some of the greatest hope to both regenerate landscapes, societies and human health. And let's say if they're interviewing people like us in 50, 60 years, they can say, well, look what agriculture's doing now. It's one of the great change agents back to health that we've got. But at the moment, it's not a good track record, is it?
No, it's not.
No.
Unfortunately.
Yeah.
We've got a long way to go, but at least we now have people that understand this and are advocating this. And thank you, Charles, for your advocacy. It's incredibly important. It takes all of us to be able to get the word out, and market advertising agencies will tell you that it takes a minimum of 8 impressions to get somebody to decide to buy a product or to change their mind on something.
Yeah.
And I think that holds true here as well. Farmers, ranchers have to keep hearing this over and over before they finally decide that they need to make a transition. So the voices are important, and thank you so very much for being one of those critically important voices. And this has been a conversation with Charles Massy. Thank you, Charles.
No, pleasure, and thanks very much.
Here.
Vice versa with your organisation. So
thank you.
It's been a great experience.
Thank you.
Yeah.